everybody, and welcome to Listen to Daddy. We are your hosts, Daddy Rob and
Daddy Rod. Thank you for joining us today.
yeah,
And
we're very excited today because for the very first time we have a guest that's going to be joining us in the broadcast, and we'll get to him later. But we're really excited about the what he's going to be sharing with us. But before we bring him on and before we do anything else, we thought it would be a good idea to remind you who we are, because this may be your first broadcast that you're watching. So I'd like to start with introducing myself. I am a therapist. I have a master's degree in both social work and education with a focus on human sexuality. I'm also a former leather title holder, competed at IML, all that exciting stuff. But the big thing, the reason I did all that was to kind of get a platform to be able to talk about things like this. And what Listen to Daddy specifically wants to talk about is sex and sexuality for older gay men in our community, and providing them information that they may not get elsewhere. And I was going to give them your bona fides, Rod, but I think probably sounds better coming from you. So, what's your background in human sexuality and public health?
okay, so I've been doing HIV and STI prevention as an educator, as a tester, also administratively as a program director for close to 40 years. I like to say I started when I was 2, but that's not true. I started actually when I was 18 years old, a student at Oberlin College, and currently I'm a researcher with us helping us here in Washington, D.C., where I'm in their research department, supporting a lot of the work that they do around PrEP, particularly in the Black community, and we've got a number of studies going on there. In addition to my professional work, where I've been known to talk about and train folks and my colleagues on sex positivity and pleasure-based strategies as it relates to HIV and STI prevention. Along with Rob, I'm also a leather man, have been active in the leather community, one of the co-founders of Onyx Mid-Atlantic, with its headquarters here in DC, also a 2-time title holder, Leatherman of Color in 2011, as well as American Leatherman in 2017. But I think most importantly for me, as to who do I think I am to be able to talk about sex, is that at 56, just turned 56, and I love sex. I love sex. But in case you didn't know, I love sex. I enjoy it, and I really want other people to enjoy it too. And I think that kind of leads into our topic for today is we want to positively get you sexually educated. So I'm excited, and actually I'm going to punt it back. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, Rob and I also have a history with Widener University. In their Master of Education program is known, has a focus on human sexuality. Rob completed his master's. I am still working on mine. But yeah, and that's how we reconnected. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Rob to kind of get the conversation started.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up the Widener thing. I was about to mention that and completely blanked out on it. But what we're talking about today, as far as sex positivity and sex education, I want to start by saying sex positivity, I think, as a term, it needs to be explained. And because I think sex positivity came out as a response to sex negativity, which is what we've encountered in our society when it comes to sex education. I think what we're going to be talking about, I'll go into this later, but it's more sex neutral. It's not having any kind of a judgment on sex one way or the other. I love that Daddy Rod started with he loves sex. I love sex too. But a lot of the information that we get in our formative years is about how dangerous sex is and how and sacred to the point of don't touch it and don't talk about it. And with the information that we do eventually get in educational systems, particularly right now, is very much focused on sexual disease and prevention. So a lot of what is taught to children, if it's taught at all, is very much about fear. And a lot of it is about saving yourself for that perfect someone, and that if anything goes wrong, it's probably your fault. So that's a very difficult way to go into sexuality, and I commend you, Daddy Rod, and anybody else who's very considers themselves sex positive, because you're overcoming a lot of early training on what sex and sexuality is. And particularly, I'm going to hone in directly on gay men, because we've gotten a bad rap for a long time in regards to human sexuality. For the longest time, we were considered an aberration, a psychological defect, that there were problems with us. And then for those of us in our generation, during for your formative sexual years when you were exploring, as a gay man, probably what a lot of the information you got was around HIV and that sex can kill you. Sex is a very scary thing. That sex is, you have to wrap yourself in a garbage bag before you have sex. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. And intimacy and fun and sexuality and all that, the good stuff we like about sexuality, people would figure out when you were older. When you got out into the world, all of a sudden you would know how to have good sex, which is not the case. It's actually interesting. Right before we started broadcasting, I was watching a little comedy clip on YouTube, and the stand-up comedian was talking about how he thought that sex education should be fun, and that he had a sex educator in the audience who was talking about how she teaches 9-year-olds, kids in 4th grade. And she said that a lot of it is about just getting the right word for body parts. And he said, well, when do you get to the point where you're like, how do you do the actual physical stuff? And she said, oh, we don't even do that in college. And he said, that's the information I need. I need to know how to pleasure a person every time and how to get pleasure myself. And if you're wanting that from our sex education system, you're not going to get it at this point in time. But Daddy Rod and I want to particularly help gay men who get no information at all about how that physically works. There's very few movies you can see outside of porn that kind of explores sexual intimacy between two men. And so relationships, generally when we talk about them, are very heteronormative in the sex education space, and we want to bring in some homo fabulous into heteronormativity, and that sex is not just about the orgasm, or sex is not just about what you can produce from that procreation, any of that stuff. It's generally the focus is just very much on the physical end result, and we don't get a lot of all the good sex stuff before the orgasm. In fact, a lot of people are like rushing towards the orgasm. And the orgasm for me is the period on the end of the sentence. Sex is coming to an end the way that's normally been talked about. And I like the whole sexual experience. I feel like I'm trying to cram a lot of information in before we get our guest in. I'm going very fast. So I'm actually going to give myself an opportunity to take a breath and let Daddy Rod talk a little bit about what it means to bring sex positivity into that kind of background that we have on sex and sexuality in the sex education space.
All right. Thanks, Daddy Rob. So I think, first of all, being in HIV and STI prevention, for those of you who don't know, STI stands for sexually transmitted infections. So if you're familiar with the term STD, sexually transmitted disease, it's actually the infection that gets passed. So the work that I've been doing over the past almost 4 decades is how to prevent those things. And of course, you really can't talk effectively about HIV and other STIs without talking about sex. And one of the challenges is so much around that we talk about sex is so negative, in terms of people feeling ashamed when they come in to wherever I work, either to get training or to get tested, that there's so much shame around, yeah, I had sex. Yeah, I had sex with more than one person. Yeah, I didn't use a condom. And I think sex positivity is, first of all, about restoring people's senses of joy and pleasure. In fact, we talked, Daddy Rob and I, before we did the podcast, in terms of, well, how do we see sex positivity? And one of the things that we both noted is it's really about changing in terms of how we think about sex and sexuality. How do we protect and enhance the joy and pleasure of the sexual experience? Let me say that again. How we protect and enhance the joy and pleasure of the sexual experience. Because I think a lot of sex education really is negative around talking about risk, as in sex is potentially dangerous, sex is potentially harmful. We want to protect you from the dangers that sex is. Whereas sex positivity says, child, get your life with sex. Get your life, enjoy it, get as much of it as you can, and here's what you can do to reduce your worry around STDs, STIs, and HIV, so that you can have an enhanced experience. So a lot of the work that I do is really about counteracting the sex negativity around sex, and just really, as educators and as human beings, how do we enjoy it more? And I think there are particular challenges that happen as we get older. And again, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time to listen to Daddy, this is probably, if not the only, one of the few podcasts of any type that really has older gay and bisexual men front and center in terms of bi, for, and about. So in terms of really focusing on sex education, one of the things that I like to say is that for those of us who are older, not just gay men, but let's focus on us for now, is that we need it. First of all, our bodies are changing. What does that mean? Well, there's a joke when I was younger that I used to hear about sex and older men saying, it takes me all night to do what I used to do all night. And at first, I didn't get it. But now at 56, it's like, okay, I can get it. So bodies are changing, maybe in terms of libido, maybe in terms of qualities of erection, maybe also those things are intact, but we might be dealing with other issues. For myself, and I'll do my own disclosure, again, HIV lives with me. I am HIV positive. So there are some health things in terms of medications and health in general that I realize that as I get older, HIV does play a factor. One of them being heart issues. I had a heart attack at age 52. And a lot of that had to do with lifestyle choices as well as medications that were elevating my cholesterol. Cholesterol also having issues around blood flow, which can also affect quality of erections. So it's all related. So as I deal with health issues, as I see my body change, how I think about sex, how I approach sex is very different. And I really like and I want to linger on what Rob said earlier, Daddy Rob said earlier about, and I think with the body changes, how we feel and think about sex can change as well, and that's okay. Orgasms do not have to be the goal of sex. You know, Rob and I have often talked about how orgasm-centered sex, and by the way, please do not say Daddy Rob does not like orgasms. I like to come just like everybody else. In fact, I love cum. And that's a whole nother thing. I think that's a whole nother section we can get into later about how sex negativity may even impact how we end HIV. The HIV epidemic may have us feel about our own body fluids. So I want to save that for a little bit later discussion, particularly when David comes in. But yeah, we may have to learn if our body changes how we think about orgasm, how it may not be orgasm centric. Rethinking not only the orgasm, but also what is it that I want out of sex? Maybe I don't want the pressure to be, to come, to breathe my partner, to always have to shoot. Maybe there are other things that I want to do also to enjoy sex. And again, not be so focused on, avoiding HIV or other STIs, but how do I enjoy myself? How do I learn to talk about sex? I think as older gay and bisexual men, we're from a generation where you didn't talk about sex. And especially as guys who like other guys, you definitely didn't talk about your desires. And so now all of a sudden we're in an era, thanks to HIV, where now all of us, and plus also a more openness about it, where I think many of us are challenged to talk about that we like other guys or what we like to do, whether we're topping, whether we're bottoming, whether we're versatile. We're being really challenged to really say and to share what it is that we like to do. And for many of us, for most of our lives, that was something we were discouraged to doing. Sexual education for us means how do we as gay men, as older gay men who are sexually active, how do we really start saying what we want? I talked earlier about how to enjoy ourselves, how to still embrace who we are physically. Also, one other thing is sex education for those of us who are older is about having honest conversations with our medical providers. For example, and again, I talked about HIV living with me. I also talked about having a heart attack, so I'm a heart patient. This means that I had to talk with my doctor about what did it mean for me to take statins and other heart medications while I'm taking pleasure enhancing substances. In my case, also Viagra. And it was very interesting when I was in the hospital 4 years ago for my heart attack. The women who were doctors kept saying, no, no, don't do it, don't do it. And I noticed that the men doctors just kind of stood in the background, waited until they left, and they said, we'll tell you the real deal. You can do both, but you have to be careful.
Yeah, I think
And you do have to talk with your doctor.
I
Yes, go
I
ahead,
think what
Rob.
you're touching on here is that the one of the biggest problems with sex negativity is the shame that comes along with it. Because what
Exactly.
we're taught is that by not talking about it openly, like in our family units or in places where sanction conversations about anything, like church or school, places where you're taught how to be a human being. If they're not talking about it, then the message you're getting is that you shouldn't and that there's something to be ashamed of there. And whenever it is talked about, it's usually in the context of sin or disease or any of that. You talked about, loving cum. If somebody, a lot of people experience sex shame to the point where once they orgasm, if they have any residual things on their body, they immediately have to jump up out of bed and wash it off because they have to get that unclean feeling off of them. And a lot of us like to wallow in that. So, this that dichotomy between where you are in your sexual journey. And a lot of heteronormative people don't have to think about that because their sexuality is sanctioned and they've got like steps on how they're supposed to do it and who's in charge and all that. As gay men, we have the opportunity to kind of create that kind of experience for ourselves that we can make the sexuality our sexuality very much pleasure center because we're not trying to procreate, we're not trying to maintain the status quo of society. We're just trying to, for the most part, enjoy ourselves. And unfortunately, because of the education, we got a lot of gay men ground their concepts of sexuality in heteronormativity. So they try to kind of mimic the heterosexual role models they had in their life, but when your equipment's exactly the same, it doesn't exactly fit into each other the way that taught that it does. So we kind of have to make it up as we go along for many of us because we don't have those mentors like us to be able to provide that information. Now, during this particular broadcast, we're not going to be showing you how to have sex, but I think at some point we will. There will be bananas and donuts and all sorts of things involved, and we'll get down to the nitty gritty of it. But we got to stop acting like it's a shameful thing that we can't talk about and we can't have fun with.
Well, on that, why do we need to do, but unless we're doing food play, why can't we use dildos?
We can use whatever the hell. Well, there are some restrictions on YouTube as far as
I know
what you can show, but
FCC.
yeah, I can see a dildo and know it's plastic. I know that's not a real penis, flopping through the
Exactly.
air. Yeah, the fact that people have gotten in trouble in school systems for using bananas to show how to put condoms on, we're getting really into the nitty gritty of what we're referring to as sex negativity. And I want to bring back the term I used before, that sex neutral, because sex positivity, again, I think is just a reaction to sex negativity. We see so much of it's shame-based stuff, and we want to say that we're presenting a different side of it. But I think what might be beneficial for us is to think that we are pleasure-focused and that we are, and as far as sex education goes, we want to be neutral. We don't want to have a judgment. We don't want to tell people it's the greatest thing in the world. We don't want to tell them it's the worst thing in the world. We don't want to tell them how to do it. We just want to give the information that you can use however you want, and there's no judgment on it whether it's good or bad.
And it's funny because and I think because of my work around sex positivity and pleasure-based strategies, I personally don't believe in a sex neutral approach because I think so much around what we do is so negative. in terms of presenting sex, whether we're talking HIV, STI prevention, whether we're talking about sex education in schools. It really is negative, even down to how we may see our bodies. One of the things that I think plays into the negativity, and this is where we have to talk about religion. Those of us who grew up Christian know the scripture that says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And I think that's been the basis for how we view anything related to the flesh, related to the body, which includes sex. And one of the challenges that I have with that is, on the one hand, you can't say the body is a bad thing, but at the same time, we all come into this world with a body. And if you look at any of the creation stories, that God looked at all his creation, including his physical creations, and said, this is good. So sometimes I like to start there, because there is a lot of, and I'm going to go back to what you talked about, shame. There is a lot of shame in our bodies, especially, and again, looking at gay and bisexual men, for those of us who are in the culture, there's so much shame in terms of how our bodies look or don't look, if it doesn't fit a particular body build, body style, stuff like that. There's a lot of shame. And I think outside of the leather and kink communities, there's a lot of shaming around aging. Like, nobody will, who's that old queen? Not just queen, who's that old queen sitting in the corner? As if there's even more of a negative thing around the fact that we're getting older, and that the grays, and I've seen friends and colleagues panic at gray hairs coming in. I wasn't always that way, because I used to dye this. And then I would look at some of the guys on Twitter, for example. Yes, dirty Twitter, I'm looking at you. I'm always looking at you. And I would see these hot guys with these beards, with their salt and pepper. And I'm like, what am I ashamed of? What am I embarrassed by? And it's funny, because one of the things I appreciate about this conversation, where we're touching on some things, we may not be able to go into depth like we would like to, is Dr. Brene Brown does a lot of work around shame and around trauma. And one of the things that she says is shame flourishes in isolation, when we're not able to talk about certain things. But whereas if I have embarrassment about growing, or fears around growing older, and I know if theoretically speaking, you do too, Rob, then it's like, okay, let's talk about it. And then maybe in talking about it, we feel less ashamed about it. It's like, okay, I'm not the only one. So, and let's even start there, that older gay men are here, that we are sexy, we are attractive, even as our bodies are changing, and we have to learn, or maybe in some cases relearn, as our bodies change, as we have health challenges, that it's okay to have sex.
I like how we overcome that. I like, as gay men, that we're part of a community that is starting to embrace more the aging man, and seeing the sexuality. And I think a lot of it is that we're living longer. A lot of it is that each generation that comes up, there's more of us that are out and proud, and more of us that are wanting to reclaim our time. And even in the heteronormative community, when you talk about elderly sex, people get the heebie-jeebies. But you're never too old, and and this is a weird transition, because I don't want to say that, I don't want to move on from you're never too old to go to our next guest. But Daddy Rod, if you would do me the pleasure of introducing our guest for today, I would appreciate it.
Okay, and as soon as I can find what I am looking for, there it is. So our very special guest is someone who I've known for decades, and I've admired up close as well as from afar, Dr. David Malebranche. Dr. Malebranche currently serves as the Senior Director of Global HIV Medical Affairs at Gilead Sciences. He is a board certified, let me see, and forgive me for this, board certified internal medicine physician with over 20 years of clinical experience in sexual health and the prevention, treatment of HIV and STIs, men's health, correctional health, student health, racial inequalities in medicine, and LGBTQ health. Passionate about community engagement, outreach, and activism, Dr. Malebranche has appeared in the video series Ask the HIV Doc, as well as the YouTube series Revolutionary Health with the Counter Narrative Project, and I hope he'll take some time to talk about those projects as well. He also has a long history of conducting qualitative HIV behavioral prevention research among Black same gender loving men and has published more than 50 articles in medical and public health journals. He has held several academic faculty appointments, most recently as Associate Professor of Medicine and Medical Director of Student and Employee Health at Morehouse School of Medicine. He currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia, and I do have to add this piece. I told some folks about Dr. Malebranche, and he's appearing on the show today. And of course, and one thing they all said, he is fine. He is fine. So with that, I want to gladly bring on Dr. David Malebranche. David, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Listen to Daddy. Thank you so much for coming aboard.
Hey, daddies. I would say daddies Rob, daddies Rod. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Yes. So we've said quite a mouthful around sexual health, particularly and sexual education, particularly as it pertains to older gay men. You are a doctor. And one of the things that I know is important to me are the conversations that I am able to have with my doctor, and not with him as the subject matter expert, but me as my subject matter expert, to say, these are my concerns, these are what's going on with me. How can you help? Can you say a little bit more from your side of the doctor's table as a physician in terms of how important that is when we're talking about sexual health?
Yeah, I mean it's really important. I can't tell you how many times people have been really excited to see me as their clinician, and then once they see the style and the approach through which I approach people, very kind of conversational. I treat patients as, what would I be saying if it were a friend of mine, if it was a good friend of mine and I was giving them advice, or how would I want somebody to talk to me about something, to kind of set the mood, set the environment, set the ambiance, so I feel comfortable in telling them all the things that I need to. And I think it's important. That part of it is important because I think a lot of us separate clinicians or healthcare professionals from the community. And the fact is, we all are members of the community. This is just part of our job that we come in. So we've been on that other side of the equation as well. It's just unfortunate that a lot of healthcare professionals, a lot of physicians don't tap into that. So they don't think to themselves as they're engaging with people, like, hey, would I like this shit said to me? Would I like somebody to treat me like this, or to speak these things, or shut me down when I'm information about my sexual health, or how I'm the expert of my body, like you were talking about earlier. And I think when you have that kind of sense of humility, you have that sense of, this could be me as well. It'll help you approach people in a much more human centered equation. And I think for a lot of us, folks getting older, whether you're young or whether you're an elder, whether that's, some people see it as over 50, some people see it over 65, whatever that means, we're all getting older. So it's all of us are facing, and it has implications for our sexual health and how we enjoy sex, our journey with how we identify with what we like, what we don't like, and it's a fluid journey. So it's not something that's just set in stone.
And so with all of that, one of the questions, and with Listen to Daddy, we tend to focus on older gay and bisexual men. If there was, actually, I'm going to be gracious, if there were two things you would want older gay men, particularly who come to you for health issues, what are some of the things you would want older gay and bisexual men to be aware of in terms of sexual health?
I mean, one of them is, the assets approach to sexual health that the two of you were talking about. And I'm going to say 3 because I can't limit it to 2. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So I would say your sexual health, I would say, focus on pleasure, focus on what you like, focus on what gives you enjoyment, focus on how that's different from it was before, how that's evolving, and being honest with yourself about that. Like you said, and I love the way you phrased it, Rod, you said, get your life on, and then I can talk to you about how we can create a space where you have less worry about sexually transmitted infections. And I notice you're very intentional with the language, as you should be, because the word risk is a very loaded word. And we've used it in public health for years, as both of you know, and we still use it today. A lot of people still use it, and we get it confused, we get it twisted, versus if a behavior is quote unquote risky, and whether a person is risky. And we've just really begin to scrape the surface where people are actually hearing, hey, when you say that I'm engaging in risky behavior, I see myself as risky. So one, I would say focus on the sexual health part of it and start with pleasure, and then figure out what you're engaging in and how to best, reduce the worry that you may have about any kind of exposure to STIs. Second one would be mental health. I think we ignore that a lot of times in the intersection it has with our physical health, as well as our sexual health, as a subset of that physical health. And I think for older men, we may become more isolated, we may become more withdrawn, we may feel that we're not as connected as we used to be in communities because of whatever reasons. And some people can go through a lot of feelings of isolation, stigma, shame, with how body conscious a lot of gay communities are. People will feel that once they get a little bit of a gut, that no one's going to appreciate them. Once they don't have the six-pack abs, once they don't have the cut arms and the widespread lats, nobody's going to look to them anymore. And so I think mental health is something you always have to keep your eye on. And whatever suits you as far as your mental health and keeping your mental health positive and healthy. It could be a therapist, it could be a clinical social worker, it could be if church or spirituality is kind of your way that you get your mental health on. If it's communing with friends, if it's recharging by yourself, if it's reading, if it's going to the gym, find out what works for you and realize that you have to tap into that to make sure that you're addressing your mental health as much as you would your physical health. And then finally, I think this is not just for people who are living with HIV, but everyone else is really thinking about what happens when we're all aging. And Rod, I really appreciate your vulnerability and your openness to kind of invite us into, the different diagnoses that you've had and what you've been going through and the heart attack you had 4 years ago. I think that's one of those things where we navigate this earth and we think we're younger, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh shit, wait a minute, I'm in my mid-50s, like what the hell's going on? And so you may not feel it, but your body has that tread on it. Your body has that mileage on it. And unless you get routine screenings, and this could be for your liver, for your kidneys, for your heart, making sure you have vaccinations, getting screened for certain healthcare screenings, whether it be colon cancer, or if you have a family history, prostate cancer, those kind of things you need to stay on top of. And so I think if it were, just kind of wrapping up the three things, it would be your sexual health as a sex positive pleasure beginning, mental health in whatever form it is that helps you get your mental health on, and then 3, focusing on the general aspects of aging that you need to as you get older.
That's a lot of great information. I want to remind anybody who's actively listening at the moment that we do have a live chat going on the YouTube channel. So if you have any questions for anybody or comments about this, great. And I really appreciate it's unusual in sex education. I think it's becoming more prevalent for people to speak less about the risk and shame aspects and try to focus on the pleasure. But I mean, it's still a smaller population, and it, unfortunately, because there are fewer people than should be who are focused more on the pleasure aspect than trying to push the risk aspect, that there a lot of people are hesitant to ask questions as Daddy Rod had mentioned earlier. There's can be hesitation in talking to your medical provider about things that are of a sexual nature, even if it's a decrease in enjoyment. If something's happening with your body where you're enjoying that act less, instead of saying, let me talk to my doctor, see if there's something I can do about it, they just stop that activity or just tell themselves it's part of aging. And maybe that's, are there some common things that you can think of that people write off as aging that's actually something that's treatable to allow people to regain pleasure enjoyment?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of things, and I mean, you both have been talking about it earlier. You see me trying to dodge the sunlight that's kind of creeping in and going over through the blinds over here because I can't close these as well. So I apologize about that. But yeah, and I think some of the words that come to mind. I think about stigma, but we talk about it in terms of stigma a lot. And I think, and I also heard a term the other day, which I didn't realize was a term, where people are talking about penetrative sex. So whether you're a top or a bottom, and then they call it side. If you don't like
Yes.
either, and I was like I had never heard of that. Someone said, "Yeah, you side," and I was thinking to myself, that's always been my flow, which has been I don't really count intercourse one way or the other. That's not the end goal for me. Um, it was more about intimacy, and that's a phrase we don't talk about enough, and we don't emphasize enough when it comes to our sexual health. Is what intimacy means. And Rob, you were talking a lot about heteronormative. I just like to break it down. I won't say heteronormative. I'll say what straighty does. Straighty usually sets the tone because you've got two very distinct genders and defined roles society-wise that they're brought into. Whereas if you have two men with two penises and may have different variations of what they embrace as traditional gender role norms, whatever that is, it's harder to navigate what intimacy looks like and how we express it. And it may be different in different cultures. I know it's different for a lot of Black men, what we say, how we navigate our feelings, how we express hurt, how we express our emotions. It may be different from our white counterparts. It may be different from counterparts. It may be different from Asian Pacific Islanders. So we have to consider all these things when we're talking about how we navigate stuff. And I think when older men are kind of coming in and they're talking to their clinician and saying, well, hey, this is wrong with me or I'm having a problem, the goal of the clinician is not to just brush it off. We are always taught to maybe do some tests and more, explore the organic causes of what that complaint could be, also explore the psychological causes of what that could be, as we typically don't understand fully how your psychology, how your mental health may actually impact with your immune system and with physical symptoms. We still don't have a great grasp or understanding on that, so we kind of throw it into a wastebasket. And then what you want to do is not tell the person to stop doing the behavior, just like, well, that's the shit that happens when you're older. Like, that's not an answer. So it has to be solutions based. And the problem with it is that just as you all have been talking about, we're always involved in, kind of deficits first. Disease, public health is always a disease first model. We're always talking about deficits. We're talking about what are the barriers to X, Y, and Z, and then how we can I'm more interested in kind of health and wellness, how we promote that, and what are the facilitators to better health, and how do we package those up and reproduce those so people can incorporate that. And I think the same thing, those are public health tenets, but I think when you look at one-on-one clinician and patient interactions, you have to do the same. So this may not work like it used to back in the day. So if your erections aren't as hard, yeah, we could try Viagra, Cialis, we could try all these medications that can help enhance this. We can try penis pumps, we can try injectables, we can try a bunch of different options with that. We can also look into whether it's a psychological cause of why you're having a problem with erections. Have you thought about if it's a certain person, or have you thought about whether you've been depressed or something else has been going on? So exploring that. We can check levels of hormones to see if that may be a potential cause of it, although it's not as we typically, see hormones like low testosterone, things like that, causing erectile problems. And then finally, it's like, well, okay, if this is just something that comes along with age, what other ways can we explore your sexuality, your intimacy, your connectedness with another human being, with someone that you love or someone you want to be close to, or someone that you just want to connect to, whether it be temporarily or whether it be on a consistent basis or whether it be for the long term. And we don't talk about how connectedness is part of health. And it's part of when we look specifically the 40 plus years of dealing with the HIV epidemic and the continued, although it's getting away from this, the continued emphasis on condom use. People don't want to recognize that condomless sex is a way that you connect with someone For a lot of people, whether you're straight, whether you're gay, whether you're whatever in between as far as your sexual identity or orientation, if you remove that condom, you are letting somebody know that you trust them to a certain extent. And you're also connecting with them on a closer, intimate level that straighty gets to enjoy that privilege all the time. We, because of the way our sexuality has been traumatized by the HIV pandemic and HIV epidemic. So we have to be able to work with people to say, what do you like? Do you like using condoms? Do you not like using condoms? Is penetrative sex important to you? And flip it back to the human being that's sitting in front of you. What is important for you? What's a great quality of life with regards to your sexual health? What does that look like for you? What can you accept? What's your ideal? That it would be perfect? And what can you say? Okay, it's not going down like that. If this is going to be happy. So it's important to gather what the priorities are and what's important to that individual sitting in front of you, instead of projecting what the medical community or the public health community feels that you should be prioritizing with regards to your sexual health.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And acknowledging that what most people need is information. They don't need judgment, and people can make up their minds about what they want to do with that information. That it should not be our job as professionals to say you should wear a condom or you shouldn't wear a condom. This is what condoms do. This is their efficacy. These are the options you have. This is their efficacy. You get to decide that. And what we need are more professionals. Well, I'm just going to say this, like us, who give people permission to ask these questions and to get better information so they can make better decisions. And on that note, we've got a couple of questions from people who are currently watching. This is fantastic. So one of the questions we have is there a risk with saliva or spit or spit, however you want to call it, saliva, spit, while engaging in analingus? And anybody who wants to answer that is fine. But is there a risk with saliva, spit while engaging in analingus? So licking out somebody's asshole, is there risk involved with that? Even though we just said we don't talk about risk.
The second, Rod, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Well, my first question is, are we talking about HIV or any other STIs? Because first of all, when it comes to HIV, if you're just looking at saliva, the answer is no. And David, maybe you can correct me on this. I would be more concerned about other STIs when it comes to saliva, when it comes to spit. David?
Yeah, I think, with regards to, they used to always tell us this in medical school and beyond, that, people be worried about kissing. Can you get it from kissing and saliva? And the analogy that we used to say is that you would have to drink a bucket of someone's saliva to get as much virus. And again, that was before we had the knowledge of when someone who's living with HIV is on medications and is undetectable, that would probably make it, you'd probably have to fill it up with, a whole canister of spit in order to get HIV that way. So it's very low risk with regards to HIV. With regards to other things, I mean, you think about oral transmission, there's a theoretical risk of, oral to genital or oral to anal transmission of gonorrhea, chlamydia. You can have gonorrhea and chlamydia in the throat. You can have gonorrhea and chlamydia in the anus. So theoretically, there's a potential risk with that. You also think about other viruses. So those are the two bacteria, gonorrhea and chlamydia, that you would think about. And I'm not going to give any numbers on what the percentage is, because I don't think we have the studies that could adequately estimate what that risk could possibly be from engaging in mouth to anus sex. But with those two bacteria, gonorrhea and chlamydia, there's a potential with viruses like human papillomavirus or HPV that causes warts, and then also herpes simplex virus or HSV can be transmitted from kissing or oral to genital sex. So those are the four that I would think of that come immediately to mind. When you think about syphilis as well, syphilis is spread, it's a bacteria, it's spread by skin-to-skin contact. So yes, theoretically that could be as well. Sometimes at the end of the day, and I remember talking with a brother who was in New York City at STI clinic in Harlem, and he had like 40 or 50 visits for different STIs over the span of a few years. Like he was getting it in, got exposed. He was unlucky in a lot of respects of getting exposed to STIs. Now I remember I was talking to him about behaviors. We were talking about which behavior. When I started to bring all the STIs that you could potentially get from certain behaviors, it's like, damn, I can't even have sex at all. Like, he was really depressed about that. And as I was sitting here actually explaining the theoretical risk from skin-to-skin contact, whether it be herpes, HPV, human papillomavirus, or syphilis, and then some of the less likely that you probably need a little bit more fluid contact, which would be gonorrhea and chlamydia, you start to think to yourself, and if you use the phrase risk, like a lot of public, every time you connect with somebody, there is a potential quote unquote risk. But our job is to not worry you about that, not have you get all bunged up with that and say, oh my God, I can't do anything, I can't do anything. It's like, no, what I want you to do is live your life, enjoy the sex that gives you the most pleasure with the person or persons that give you the most pleasure, and then come routinely to get yourself checked out. And then we can check things out and discuss any worries you may have, screen for anything, and make sure that you're okay. The message shouldn't be don't have sex because there's a lot of shit out there. The message should be enjoy your sexual life and treat your sexual health just as serious as you treat any other aspect of your health.
And before we go to the next person, just real quickly, this is where I want to bring in DoxyPep, because if someone is concerned about, any STIs, and say they may be on PrEP to reduce their risk, to reduce their worry around contracting HIV, DoxyPep, doxycycline, is a known antibiotic that is effective definitely against fighting syphilis and chlamydia, and has some effectiveness, not as much, against gonorrhea. So for the person who contributed that question, great question. If you want to reduce your risk, if you want to reduce your worry around contracting anything from eating ass, I would just say talk with your doctor about doxycycline. And if your doctor is hesitant, there are other places like a clinic, a health center, where you can go get some doxycycline. But yeah, eat ass, go for it. And what I would add to that is let's help reduce your worry around contracting anything with some doxy, which is only meant to be used not ongoing, but right. Say after you have a session. I hate encounter, but after you have a session or 2 or 3, within 72 hours, 3 days after that, if you have a concern, you can take some doxy, 200 milligrams.
Yeah, and you see how
go ahead.
To get your head out of, even Rod, you said a couple of times, risks. It's been so ingrained
exactly
in us that even we who are pretty versed and still trip up over that. I love the phrase that you used, that it can reduce your worry. I love that. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because a lot of our concepts of sex and sexuality are still those tapes that we got from somebody else, and you have to actively work against it, otherwise they continue to run. And you talked about the doxycycline. It just reminds me that I remember a doctor complaining about the fact that you could tell when a gay event was coming up, because all of a sudden he had clients who were saying that or patients who were saying that they had sex when the person was positive for something. Could they get something? Because they'll immediately give them a prescription for it. But what he knew was happening was that they were anticipating exposure to things and wanted that to be able to take at the end of whatever this weekend is. And my feeling is, if you got a plan, great, because you're thinking about it. You're actively thinking about your sex life and what you need to be happy with it. And I'd say whatever you need to do to make that work for you, it works for me. But I want to go on to the next question, because I know we haven't got a whole lot of time. And this one, and thanks for the last question, by the way, but this question is curious as to your views on the topic. I believe this is undetectable equals untransmittable. And there has been a lot in the media and commercials, etc., but people's views still have not changed. So what are the thoughts on U equals untransmissible?
I mean, I can start, and Rod, please pepper in because I may miss some things. But because we've been doing a podcast recently and have had to talk about undetectables, untransmittable, just so people understand to review the concept. Undetectable essentially means when we test for the amount of virus in the blood of someone who's living with HIV, that we actually usually that's less than 50 copies or less than 20 copies is the most accurate testing that we have nowadays. So that's defined as undetectable. It doesn't mean that there's a cure, but it means that the number of copies of virus in the blood is so low that we can't really detect it by traditional methods. Now, where that comes into the equals untransmittable part, multiple studies that have been done, I'm thinking about Partners 1, Partners 2, Opposites Attract. Some of them have, and they did studies with couples where one partner was living with HIV and one partner was negative or not living with HIV, reported the number of condomless sexual acts they had, and then followed them along to see who actually got HIV, if the partner who was HIV negative actually was exposed to HIV and seroconverted to be positive. And what they found in all these thousands of condomless sex acts, and it's important to note that there were heterosexual couples, there were same-gender couples as well, and there was not one transmissible act when the partner who was living with an HIV had a viral load that was less than 200 copies per milliliter. I mentioned 50 copies or 20 copies, but these studies were done back in the day where 200 was the number that was listed as being undetectable. So when we say U equals U or undetectable equals untransmittable, it means that someone who is living with HIV, who has their viral load less than 200 copies and maintains that for 6 months, they pose zero risk to their partners who are not living with HIV of transmitting the virus. It's an important thing and an important concept that is, but nowadays there are still people that don't believe in that, even with the science right in front of them, the stats, the numbers, all in front of them. They're just not going to buy it because they come from times and days where they still are maybe engaged in judgment, or they still think that condoms have to be part of the equation. What I like to look at it as is that it's knowledge that that's treatment, what we call treatment as prevention. So if you have someone who's living with HIV, if you treat them, that's also a form of prevention to their own sexual partners. You also have pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. You have HIV post-exposure prophylaxis, where you take a full course of HIV treatment medications for a month after a potential exposure. And you have condoms as well. And you have behavioral things you can do to reduce your risk for HIV. So there are options. So the goal of all this at the end of the day is to say, we've got all these different options. You get to decide how you get your freak on. And with your partner, you get to decide what forms of HIV prevention you want to use. I know some that just are happy with the partner who's living with HIV being undetectable, and that's enough. Some will add PrEP to that mix. Some will just use PrEP. Some will use PrEP and treatment as prevention. Some will add condoms to that mix as well. It's up to you. So we're at the point where we have so many great interventions that can prevent HIV that we don't have to live in this world anymore where we're just saying condoms. You get to pick and choose based on your conversations with your sexual partners. I know that was a lot that I said. Rod, anything else you want to add to that?
Really quickly to the other comments as well. It really is meant to fight the stigma and the fear of someone having sex with someone like myself with whom HIV is living with me. So that it isn't like, oh my God, I had sex with Rod and we may not have used protection. Oh my God, I got HIV and all of the stigma and the fear that may come from that. But no, I am undetectable as well. And I 3 weeks ago, had my doctor's appointment and boom, I am undetectable. So I pose little to no threat to anyone sexually. And I'll stop right there.
Yeah, and I think it's great to have that factual information, and we can also allow people to have heard that information and make a different choice. I mean, you can restrict yourself however much you want based on whatever your comfort level is, and I think that's something we have to respect as sex educators, is that our only job is to provide information. Our job is not to tell people what to do. It's to make people as clear as possible on the what could potentially occur with their choices, but they get to make those choices, and I think that particularly that's a very important piece of information, particularly for people who are not straighties, that you get to formulate for yourself the decision about what is good and bad for you on any level, whether you're talking mental health, physical health, spiritual health, any of those. You get to decide for yourself, because ultimately you're the one who has to live with those choices, not us.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's such a great point, Rob, because I think for a lot of people, there's still a lot of people out there who are afraid of HIV, and they may not have the education, and they may not be up to date with a lot of the data, but that's okay. I think they have to do what's comfortable with them, and I don't see it as necessarily a problem if someone says, you know what, I don't think personally I'm comfortable with that. After reading all the U=U information and all the transmission stuff and the statistics I just mentioned, some people will be like, you know what, I'm still not comfortable. And it's as sexual educators, like you said, we have to be like, okay, respect that, because it's your body, it's your sexual life. Go ahead and do what you feel comfortable over time, or it may not, but that's your decision. You get to decide that.
Yeah, and that's power. And I want to be respectful of time. We're coming up to the end of our hour. I have loved having you on as a guest. This has been very informative, and it kind of lends credence to the fact that this is important information to talk about. The fact that we had a couple of questions in, that people had permission to ask those questions and had them answers. That's what anybody should be expecting from the professionals in this field. So thank you for being a prime example of that. Daddy Rod, you want to add anything before we let the good doctor go?
A few things. David, do you have anything coming up? Like, for example, at the top of your part of the hour, we talked about your podcast that you've been part of, Ask the HIV Doctor, and there have been some other things you've been a part of. Do you want to talk about anything else that's upcoming with you?
Yeah, I would say on a work level and with the podcast, we have a podcast that's sponsored by Gilead Sciences that's called 0 Hour, where we talk about sexual health and HIV, and it's a global podcast, and you can get it wherever you get your podcast, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, wherever you get your podcast, you can pick it up. You can also watch episodes on YouTube. And so I think it's one of those things where we get to talk with global representatives, people living with HIV. We get to speak with clinicians, policymakers, researchers, community action workers, activists about HIV on the ground and kind of what it means to a lot of people, not globally, which is wonderful, wonderful to hear, because the U.S. is not the center for everything culturally, particularly when it comes to HIV. And it's important to know there are different dynamics going in different countries. And then personally, I'm working on another book. I have a book that I published in 2015, which was a memoir about my father, and I'm actually working on a second book now, but I have to tweak some things before I really start moving that forward. But those are kind of the two main things that I would want to promote while I'm on here.
All right, and while we have you here, I want to take executive daddy realness, if I can, and dub you as an honorary daddy. So I guess what that means is that moving forward, if you are back on, it would be listen to daddies, Rob, Rod, and David.
I appreciate that. It's just a joy being here. And when you guys were talking before you brought me on, I don't know if you could see in my head with everything you all were saying. So it's just good to hear a lot of the work that folks are doing. And I just think it's so important. And I think talking about sexual health instead of always talking about disease is the best way to go. So I just want to thank you all for this continued platform. Thank you all for inviting me on here. It's been an honor and a joy. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to speaking to you later.
All right.
Daddy Rod, what a great show this was. We got to speak to somebody who is very informed and very open to kind of changing the dynamics of what sex education is, which is really what this whole conversation was about. And yes. I'm curious, after this conversation, if there's anything that kind of sticks out for you as Like if anybody watching had, you wanted them to walk away with anything in particular, what would that be?
It's funny because that, first of all, and this was brought up, that sex positivity and sexual health education is ongoing. You don't arrive. And kudos to David for pointing out to me, even with me correcting my use of the word risk. It's ongoing. That it is also okay that as older gay and bisexual men, that we have our own stuff, and it's okay to have a dedicated space where we can talk about our stuff around sexual health, and that we can begin, challenging, because I think a lot of us, myself included, have some deep-seated stuff that that probably we need a push to kind of look at, and also to support each other around saying, what, maybe I will talk with my doctor about some things. What, maybe I don't have to be ashamed about, the fact that I'm still sexual, or, maybe I will look into getting some PrEP or some doxy. I didn't get a chance to ask him because we ran out of time, but I didn't get a chance to ask him about engaging older men more in public health, sexual public health information, like PrEP ads. You don't see a lot of us as older men in these PrEP ads.
Well, we definitely need to have him back.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
We can expand that conversation. And the big thing for me walking away from this is I just want to highlight again the importance of asking for information, to feel emboldened to talk to your medical professionals, to your mental health professionals, to anybody who has knowledge about human sexuality, to go to them for that information. Because there's a lot of people are receptive to those questions.
Oh, by the way, Rob, is this our debrief, or is this actually being recorded?
This is actually being recorded.
Oh, great. Okay.
We're live.
This is what we want to know. Yes.
But we got thank yous from the people who asked questions online, so they appreciated the feedback that they got as well. In fact, as you mentioned, we are actually at a little past time, but we started a little late, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and close down for now. We've got a really exciting show for you next month. Every show is exciting. You'll find more about that on the YouTube page once it's posted. We're every third Sunday of the month, so our next episode will be a month from now. Do you want to wrap us up? Yes.
Yes. Since we've got viewers here, real quickly, for those of you who may be familiar with Damon L. Jacobs and his Tub Talks, there's going to be a very special crossover event, Listen to Daddies meets Tub Talks. All four of us, myself, Damon, Daddy Rob, and Daddy Rob's husband, will be on the show to talk about relationships. So yes, it's a crossover event on a very special topic. You're going to learn a lot. So please tune in. And so that'll be the 15th, Sunday, October 15th, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
And thank you to everybody who's watching live right now. We hope you come back next month and tell some friends. And this is going to be a really interesting episode next month, so stay tuned. Thank you all for listening to us talk about sex education and bringing sex positivity to it. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what that is and feel empowered to do the work that you need to do to give yourself a great sex life. And you want to give our closing?
Yes. And with that, I'm Daddy Rob.
And I'm Daddy Rob.
I'm Daddy Rob.
And I'm Daddy Rob.
And as always, listen to
Daddy.